thank you to Elizabeth, Dr. Stack, for arranging this evening, and nice to finally meet you and be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
First time, honestly. Okay, so tonight I called the lecture The Lines Between Faith and Madness. And what I'm going to be doing is giving you a sense of the American history that relates to the rise of asylums in the 19th century and a bit in the turn of the 20th century. And what I'm going to be exploring with you is the ways in which new religious identities that were either expanding at this time or were just being founded, the ways in which outsiders in the medical profession and in the press were labeling those new religious folks as being insane. And from my larger goal as well is kind of to give you a back history on why today we have this presumptive link between religion and madness. Now, I know Elizabeth said we don't often put those together, but I think if you did a little thought experiment about meeting somebody at a party, for instance, although there are no more parties, you meet somebody, I don't know, online, and they tell you they belong to a religion that you've never heard of. And maybe they tell you that they were formerly a member of the People's Temple, you know, headed by the infamous Jim Jones. So I presume that you would have a certain assumptions about what that religious, the nature of that religious organization already. And it's very possible that some of those presumptions have to do with it being more of a mental illness or more of a diseased group than an authentic faith. So to start off, I'm going to give you a little bit of a story. A lot of what I'm going to go through tonight are stories that were depicted in newspapers throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And the first is the story of Elizabeth Houston. This comes from a newspaper account from 1841. She was described appropriately for tonight as a beautiful Irish woman. But unfortunately, she died. And she died from what was called a new disease that was sort of a scourge in the nation. And this was a disease called religious excitement. Prior to her death, readers of the newspapers were led to believe that she had attended a Baptist revival meeting. And at this Baptist revival meeting, she became convinced of her pending torment in the afterlife. She became consumed with grief after the revival, and she went home. But when she went home, she no longer wanted to attend to any of her household duties. In fact, she descended into such grief that she asked her husband to please commit her to the lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island in New York City because she feared that she might be a risk to their lives and their safety. She started to recover a little bit, but nonetheless, one day she went to the mantelpiece in her living room, stole a razor blade that had been kept there, locked herself in her bedroom with her Bible, and wouldn't come out. After failed attempts, her husband forced the door down finally and unfortunately discovered her dead. This was a kind of story that was proliferating across newspapers in the early and mid-19th century. Readers were led to believe that Mrs. Houston's death was a direct result of her involvement in evangelical Baptist revivalism, which had precipitated this disease I mentioned known as religious excitement. Her story encompasses what I see as typical facets of these kinds of stories about religious insanity, such as the white female as victim, the suggestion that her involvement in revivalism somehow resulted in the decay of her role as wife and eventually mother, and especially that her involvement in religion immediately soon after led to her death. One of my other goals this evening is to demonstrate to you how insanity charges against religious folks like Elizabeth Houston were really not charges that signaled that she had a mental illness or that she was insane, but actually were signaling larger cultural discontent with issues such as women's participation in new religion, fears about the decay of the domestic sphere, and anxiety about the evolving religious and later racial makeup of the country. So what was evangelical revivalism? I have a few images. This is one of the more famous images of tent revivals during the 19th century. And these kinds of revivals, they spawned a very negative reaction. a reaction that actually became a movement in and of itself known as anti-revivalism. Many expressed alarm as once very small denominations of Baptists and Methodists started to grow very, very rapidly. What distinguished evangelicals from other Protestants at the time, and these were Calvinist Protestants, is that instead of spending your life in constant study, in constant supplication and prayer, hoping that you would gain God's grace and be assured of salvation, evangelical preachers said you didn't need to do any of that actually. All that you needed to do was to devote yourself to Christ in this moment and experience a rebirth in Christ, and you could be assured of salvation in the afterlife. So they took essentially a lifetime of religious work down into a few moments, and those few moments were what was so characteristic of these 19th century revivals, because in those few moments, people had what we understand today as a spiritual rebirth or being reborn in the Spirit experience. So over the course of days or even weeks, people would attend these revivals. Not everyone would have a religious conversion or rebirth experience. Some people honestly were just there because it was a good show in town. But other people truly had a religious experience there. And they were called to publicly accept Jesus as their Savior and renounce their formerly sinful ways. Now the preachers, they were trying to build an enthusiasm for religion, an emotional enthusiasm that they believed had been lost in Christianity. They especially were trying to bring people to the brink of believing that they were on the edge of salvation. And this terrified some people, because what they said was, if you're on the brink and you don't accept Jesus, you're going to be burning in hell, essentially. You're going to face eternal torment. And as you can imagine, some people took that to heart, and some people, like Mrs. Houston, were overwhelmed with a sense of grief over the possibility that that could be true for them. Now you can see the space of these revivals were outside, because the crowds were so large sometimes that they couldn't fit inside anyone's home, or they couldn't fit inside existing churches. So they were outside in fields and forests. And what people exhibited there during these conversion experiences was highly physical and highly emotional states. Some people were driven to tears. Some people were ecstatically happy because of their spiritual rebirth, but other people, like Houston, were terrified of what the preachers were telling them about eternal damnation. Other people were shouting. Many people were stamping their feet. Some people fell into actual paroxysms of what was called the holy feeling, what was to them evidence that they had passed into God's grace, but to outsiders seemed like something that wasn't truly religious. So this is just a little bit of a snippet about what religious revivalism at the time, evangelical revivalism, looked like. And I think what's key to interpreting why so many people thought that this variety of religious experience was an actual form of insanity or was causing insanity is to understand three highly significant developments during this time. There's some more outdoor makeshift tent. You can see the tents in the back, so people would camp out for days or even weeks. Understanding these three different developments, and this is where I locate where religious excitement and where religious insanity as a cultural charge, which is the way that I interpret it, came from. The first is, of course, this proliferation of revivalism that I've been describing to you, and the resulting new American religious identities that resulted in part from this revivalist spirit. And I'm going to be getting into that later in my talk. The second crucial, we have only one. The second crucial element to this is what's called the, quote, revolution of the American presses. And the revolution of American presses has to do with the truly burgeoning number of newspapers that were available at the time, especially the number of dailies and weekly newspapers that were being printed. And that increase in publication had to do with advancements in printing technology, and also had to do with a larger market for reading. At this time in America, in the mid-19th century, the literacy rates are quite high. They're well above 80%, 85% in the north, and they're just a little bit lower in the south. I've seen other statistics that puts it above 90 or even 94%. And the third development that's crucial to understanding how this charge of religious insanity came about is the rise of what's called asylum medicine, or medicine that was primarily practiced within insane asylums at the time, and subsequently the medical interpretations of religion. So I'm going to take the third point for the next part of my discussion, which is the rise of insane asylums. This is the New York State Lunatic Asylum in Utica, which was one of the first and largest of the state publicly funded asylums in the country. So a little bit of background about understandings of insanity at this time. By the late 18th century and early 19th century, there had been a major shift. It used to be that if somebody went insane or was considered insane, and let me just step back and say, I'm not saying mentally ill because that's not consistent with the time period. So mental illness doesn't come around as a phrase until the mid-20th century. So that's why I'm saying insane and mad. Okay. There was a major shift that happened in the thinking about madness at this time. It used to be that people who went mad or were considered mad, that there were supernatural causes for madness, and that it was an incurable condition. Maybe they were beset with an evil spirit. So what happened, unfortunately, to many people who were considered mad is that they were imprisoned, they were pushed out into the margins of society, they were kept in attics. When they were in prison, they were kept in ways that showed that many people didn't think that they were deserving of any kind of human rights whatsoever, because to be mad at this time was to be almost subhuman or animal-like. Now, a reformed spirit that was in a large part guided by Quaker efforts in Europe and simultaneously in the United States, had developed a new understanding of the human as a moral body, a person that had a moral spirit that could never, regardless of what happened to them, truly be corrupted. And so even if somebody went mad or went insane, there was still that moral heart to them that if that person was treated in the correct way, in the right place, with the exact right treatments, they could potentially recover. And that understanding is what led to the creation of what are called lunatic asylums. I'm not saying that to be derogatory, but that is what they were called at the time in Europe and simultaneously in the United States. Between 1810 and 1850, there were nearly 24 of these insane asylums that were opened in America alone. And you can see a bit of the scale of this one. Well, this is a stereograph, so it will give you a sense of the grandeur of entering the front gates. This is the Buffalo State Lunatic Asylum, the Richardson Olmsted complex, which still exists today in Buffalo. These are scenes from inside the Buffalo Asylum. You can see that it's largely they were designed to mimic being at home, and the idea, the curative philosophy that was behind them was known as moral therapy. So absolutely every detail of the construction of lunatic asylums was meant to be curative and therapeutic, from the shape of the windows, the way the light was coming in, the way the sound the sound came off the floors when you were walking, all of these elements. Here, for appropriate to our topic, the chapel inside the Buffalo State Lunatic Asylum. Do we have another one? Okay. Asylums were overseen by superintendents. These were physicians. They're essentially early psychiatrists, although they're not called psychiatrists yet. They're more commonly in this time referred to as alienists. Alienists and superintendents are interchangeable. And in the course of overseeing life and overseeing patient life, especially at the asylums, what they did was make a list of supposed causes of why their patients had been admitted. And they would document these supposed causes in reports that they would give to the boards of the asylum. So this is one from the same, the first stereograph that we saw of the State Lunatic Asylum at Utica. And you can see at the very top, religious anxiety, which is another phrase for religious insanity or religious excitement at this time. They're sort of used interchangeably, is the leading social cause, the leading moral cause of insane asylum admissions for the year 1844. Now, we have to take this with a grain of salt. We're getting a clue to that, for one, because it's called supposed cause. The physician is calling it that deliberately to signal to the board that they don't know for sure if that's the actual cause of insanity. The other grain of salt you can probably already ascertain is just how nebulous or vague some of these reasons are. Unknown is another leading cause, just being doubtful, excessive study, intemperance, fright. I mean, what do those mean? It wasn't even clear then. And one other element that's key to understanding these admission causes is that these causes were not diagnoses by the physician or by the superintendent. These were the causes that the family members, who were largely the ones that were responsible for the commitment of people in insane asylums, this is the reason that they provided to the physician when they committed their relative or their friend. So religion had never been considered in this kind of medical environment before, and it made people pretty uncomfortable. It made people very uncomfortable because most people at the time, including the alienists and the board of the asylum, are Christians, devout Christians. So they didn't like seeing that religious anxiety was the top cause, because they were worried, as you might be, that people were going to think that being religious, being devout, being a Christian even, was going to lead you into madness. And that became a whole debate that's kind of underneath some of the other discussions that I'm going to get to right now. Now, even as they were debating how to include religion without indicting religion, they had to be clear that they didn't like revivalist religion. And they didn't call it outright revivalist religion. They called it this religious anxiety or religious excitement, to be a little bit more vague about it. But they didn't like revivalist religion for the reasons that I described, which is that those revivals were very physical, very emotional. Sometimes people were there entire days or entire weeks, and it brought some people to states of exhaustion. And it was also believed that people who were already inclined to become mad, either through heredity or maybe there was some other illness that they had suffered, that it would precipitate a bout of insanity in them. And women especially were deemed vulnerable to religious insanity. And this was a reflection of the general understanding of women at the time, of being more delicate and more sensitive compared to men, and especially that their minds were susceptible to the overstimulating effects of what was said to them, especially effects such as those of these fiery sermons that the preachers are giving. Now these reports, I think I have some more examples. Here's one from an actual document. This is the Boston Lunatic Hospital, just a few years later, 1844. And you can see another more range of causes. Each line represents a different patient, too. And you can see how long they spent in the asylum in the next column. So the asylum reports such as these, they weren't just the business of asylums. In fact, they were printed and commented upon in newspapers widely at the time. They were also printed in the census. They were printed in almanacs. So collectively, these kinds of reports were widely available to folks at the time. And they used these to better understand this new institution of insane asylums. But what became, what was reported as a matter of fact, that was something that was public funding, became fuel to anti-revivalists, because they already had a big issue with revivalist measures and revivalist approaches to religion. And what they did was they looked at these kinds of documents, maybe this was better. They looked at these kinds of documents and they said, it's not just us who has a problem with these revivalist measures. There's scientific, state-mandated evidence that shows that revivalist religion, because when you looked at the more detailed elements of the report, is a problem, is actually causing insanity. It's not just causing insanity, it's causing an epidemic of insanity across the country. And we need to do something about it. So, feeling, very much justified in their assessments of revivalist religion, they started to spin and report on cases of alleged religious insanity. So, in one example of this that I want to bring you from this kind of interesting publication at the time called Brother Jonathan, and Brother Jonathan was a really widely disseminated, widely read weekly at the time, published in New York. In 1841, they reported on the story of a man named Morningstar, which is a lovely name, actually. And Morningstar apparently drowned his 9-year-old in Lake Erie. He apparently was suffering from religious insanity and attempted also to drown his wife and a second child, but they escaped. These acts of violence were reported, again, as the direct effect of religious insanity. Morningstar told reporters, apparently, that the murders were purposed to get him to heaven. A similar case occurred in Talladega County, Alabama, in 1848, where a man named Rodern murdered his son in, quote, a fit of religious insanity. He then apparently took the body, piled wood and rails upon it, and set the pile ablaze as a burnt offering to heaven. Those are just two little snippets. I was going to read more, but I think just in those ones you get an understanding of just how sensational this kind of reporting was and the ways that they directly linked this vague understanding of religious insanity with violence and with disruption of the home. And it's also easy, I think, to imagine how alarming such reports would have been to readers. Whether or not the details are exactly true, whether or not these acts of violence were actually directly caused or instigated by religious beliefs is difficult to determine, but the cultural effect, I think, is clear. Now I'd like to turn to the experiences of people who were labeled insane and who had a voice to tell the public a bit about what that was like, to have their faith demeaned into a pathology. And the first is an example from Elizabeth Stone, and she wrote this account here of her treatment and her time at the McLean Asylum in Massachusetts, and this on the left is a rendering there. And what happened to Elizabeth Stone? In 1842, she had become a convert to a new religion called Millerism. And in just a little while, I'm going to start detailing what Millerism was. But her brother, he really wasn't keen on the whole Millerism thing, and he found the whole thing to be very obnoxious, and he found her, honestly, to be pretty insufferable. That's the takeaway that I got from her account. So one day he says, you know what, Elizabeth, let's go to, I'm going to pay for you to go to this new women's boarding house. So come along with me and let's go and just kind of take a look at it because it might work out for you. You're a Lowell factory worker, you need a place to live, and I might be able to help you with that. So she goes into the, I think you understand where this is going, but she goes into the boarding house and she's looking around and it seems interesting, and then she pretty quickly recognizes that she's not at a boarding house, she's in an insane asylum, she's not getting out no matter what she does. And her brother turns around and walks away. She relates in her memoir of sorts here that that the Spirit of Christ was killed in me. And she said that because as soon as she started, she was taken in by the physicians, they started to give her medicines. And she was convinced that these medicines were truly to destroy her religious spirit. Now, to be clear, these medicines that asylum physicians were using were very harsh, heroic medicines. They would have led her to perhaps purge. They would have caused her to go into a deep sleep for a long period of time. They were really aggressive medicines. And she said that as a result of these so-called medicines, I could not look forward to never-ending eternity of happiness, for the idea of love had gone from me. I neither loved God nor this world. She sought out the asylum physician, Dr. Fox, a Congregationalist, expecting, he's a man of God, maybe he'll understand my predicament. She goes to him and she kind of explains what her situation is, and he looks at her and he laughs. He says, oh, absolutely not. You don't understand anything about the Bible. Why are you even reading the Bible? And you shouldn't be walking around here like you're some kind of spiritually endowed woman, because you're not. So she is essentially imprisoned in a place where she's forcibly being given these so-called medicines. And she's pushed to a point of depression that she becomes so depressed that she attempts to take her own life. She fashions one of her sheets into a noose and tries to hang herself. Now, she isn't successful, but the staff afterward is very much trying to dissuade her and prevent her from any further attempts at her life. So they restrain her with what was called a leather muff, which is kind of like a straight jacket for the arms, where you have very limited mobility. And they also gave her, as another form of medicine, cold baths to stop her incessant weeping. And these cold baths were often used in asylums to kind of quell people and subdue them. In her memoir's closing remarks to Christians, she gives a pretty stern warning to her readers. She warns them, "You are liable yet to have the cry raised about you, that you are insane, and to be taken and imprisoned as I have been, where violence is used to force medicine down your throat, which kills or destroys the Spirit of Christ in you." Now, Stone did eventually leave the asylum, unlike many others, but nonetheless she talks at length in her memoir about the fact that her religious spirit and faith were irrevocably damaged from her experience. So what her brother really abhorred about his sister, about Elizabeth, is that she was a convert to a new religious movement called Millerism that was really gaining steam at the time. Millerism is also known as Second Adventism, and it's predicated on the preaching of a man named William Miller. And William Miller believed that they were living on the Advent. Let me say this a different way. That they were living on the eve of the Second Advent, and the Second Advent is the second coming of Christ in the personal form, at least as Miller believed it. And tens of thousands of Americans in the late 1830s, by conservative estimates, believed in William Miller's teachings and his predictions, and they joined the movement. As an aside, if you are interested in graphic representations of historic chronologies, the Millerites, which I'm sure you are, the Millerites are really the best at that, and I have another one here. So William Miller, he essentially had this really sophisticated understanding of the Bible, and what he did was he interpreted events in the Bible and political events at the time, and he deduced through this sort of complex, what I call Bible math, represented by these figures, about when the second coming of Christ was going to be. And he made several precise predictions about when that was going to take place. One of those was in 1843 in October. Now, naturally, you might think Millerites drew a lot of criticisms because they believed in the end times. And they surely did, although believing in the end times was not necessarily a fringe idea at the time. But they also attracted a variety of denunciations regarding their mental state, and that's where we come back to religious insanity. Millerites were critiqued for hosting the large kind of revival meetings that we saw in the beginning of the lecture. And again, these meetings were taking place outside. They were taking place in areas that were not otherwise designated as religious spaces. And I think that's important because part of the criticism was that some people were very uncomfortable with this mixing of men and women in these spaces during these long nights, and people are kind of groaning and writhing and having ecstatic experiences. Now, they didn't outright come and say that that was their issue, but that's my suspicion. Critics also seized Millerites as evidence of a mass delusion for their preparations for the end times. Let's go here. This is a caricature about preparing for the end times. So what truly did happen is that people who believed in the prophecy, they didn't need their earthly belongings anymore. They didn't need their houses, so they sold all of their goods. Some people did. They shut their businesses. They left crops rotting in their fields, apples hanging on trees that they were supposed to harvest. And to people who did not believe in Miller's predictions, this led further fuel to criticism against them. There was also a long-standing rumor against them that they donned. This is a more contemporary image, which is interesting in and of itself because what I'm describing to you is sort of called the Millerite legend, and it remains today in considerations of the history of Millerism. So there was this rumor that is resoundingly denied by Millerites or Seventh-day Adventists today, what they eventually became, that they went to the tops of their houses and they put on these white muslin robes and they waited, to be ascended into heaven. One family, in fact, in Albany, New York, reportedly, quote, dressed themselves in long white robes and with white slippers on their feet, sat all day in patient yet confident expectation of the end of all earthly things. Now, I think part of this is to prove that Millerites were delusional and that they suffered from insanity, but another part of the criticism that's embedded within that is the fact that they were harmful to the local economy. it certainly didn't look good when everybody started shuttering their businesses and leaving their crops rotting in the field. Another widely spread criticism of Second Adventists or Millerites, you can use them interchangeably, is that they were causing such madness that the nation's asylums were becoming filled, that there was no room in the nation's asylums because they were filled with Millerites. And this absolutely really was not true, but nonetheless it was often cited, for instance, by the Knickerbocker, which was a newspaper in Albany at the time. William Miller's teachings were, according to the Knickerbocker, swelling the numbers that fill lunatic asylums of the Atlantic states. Now, Adventists were very aware of this kind of coverage, and they certainly, here's another satirical broadside making fun of the Millerites' expectations of ascending. Millerites were very much aware of this, and they were tracking it. They were tracking every negative portrayal of their faith, and they were reprinting them in their own publications. And one of the reasons for the general appeal of Millerism at this time, in addition to truly believing in the prophecy, was that they were really effective at spreading ideas because they were effective at publication, and they owned a variety of presses throughout the country. And they published newspapers such as the Midnight Cry and Signs of the Times. They also published thousands and thousands of pamphlets and thousands of broadsides. And they would reprint these pathologizing accounts of their faith that were mocking them and suggesting that they were filling asylums. And they would print them, and they would essentially point out that they were baseless. They would also take other efforts to sort of upend this idea of their faith as mental disease. If it's true that asylums are filled with Millerites, okay, we're going to get together, and this is what they did, a troupe of reporters from the Midnight Cry, and go to the local asylum and talk to the superintendent and ask him, how many Millerites are here? Well, often they would do that, and they would find that, in fact, there weren't that many, and if let's say they said there was 12, maybe there was 2. They also channeled their resentment about this pathologization into public sermons, into lectures, and they also directly would respond to medical publications that derided them as a source of insanity. Repeatedly, and this is something that's really across the board for almost every religious tradition I've looked at that's been labeled insane, they argued aggressively, repeatedly, ongoing, that the idea that they caused insanity, that their doctrines caused insanity, or their practice caused insanity, couldn't possibly be true, because rather than cause insanity, they cured insanity. And they were resolute about this, because to them, their religion was a healing tradition, and people had experienced healings within Adventism. So the idea that it was causing people to degrade mentally was just ridiculous to them, honestly. So they used their platforms as well to challenge the authority of medical interpretations of religion at this time. And they contended that this repeated presumed connection between asylum commitments and insanity, for instance, was actually pretty misleading if you considered the actual dynamics of insanity commitments in America. So to this end, one Adventist author for the Science of the Times newspaper wrote, "It should be remembered that to be found within an asylum of the insane is no proof of insanity. Friends have only to report a friend insane and get the opinion of a physician to that effect, and they have power to incarcerate them according to their own pleasure in any insane asylum, hospital, and for any length